my husband turned into a monster after he caught me cheating and discovered my pregnancy. Hey Reddit, I've been debating whether to post this for a long time. It's deeply embarrassing, and I've made mistakes that I'll probably never forgive myself for. But I can't keep bottling this up. I'm hoping that sharing my story will help me find some kind of clarity or peace, or at the very least, advice from those who've been in similar situations. This is the story of how my husband, Mark, the man I thought I'd grow old with, turned into someone I didn't recognize after he caught me in an affair and found out I was pregnant. I know I'm not the victim here, but the consequences of my actions became much darker than I ever imagined. Please, if you choose to respond, I just ask for understanding and kindness. I know what I did was wrong, and I'm not looking for pity, just a way forward. Part 1. The beginning of the end. Mark and I met when I was 19. He was older, 21, already in his final year of college, and seemed to have his life together. I was young and in awe of how grounded and composed he was. He wasn't the loud, outgoing type, but he had this quiet confidence that was magnetic. We connected at a mutual friend's party, and by the end of the night, I knew I wanted to be with him. Our relationship grew quickly after that. We moved in together within 2 years, got engaged, and married shortly after. It all felt like a dream come true, a whirlwind romance that turned into a stable, loving marriage. We had something good, something solid, or at least that's what I thought. But over time, things began to change. It wasn't any one event that caused the shift, but a series of small moments. Mark became consumed with his work, chasing a promotion, and I did the same with my career. We stopped making time for each other. Instead of the deep conversations and spontaneous moments of affection we used to share, our interactions became routine, mostly centered around schedules, bills, and the mundane parts of life. I would catch myself looking at Mark, wondering how we had drifted so far apart. I didn't say anything though. I kept those feelings to myself, hoping that things would improve on their own. But the loneliness I felt only grew deeper, and over time, I began to feel invisible in my own marriage. And that's when Jake entered the picture. Part 2. Enter Jake. Jake started working at my company about a year ago. He was charming, confident, and had this energy about him that drew people in. He was the kind of person who could walk into a room and make everyone feel like they were the most important person there. At first, I didn't give him much thought. He was just another coworker in a busy office. But then, we were assigned to the same project. A high-pressure, fast-paced project that required long hours and late nights. It wasn't long before we started to bond over the shared stress and exhaustion. We began talking about our lives outside of work, our goals, our dreams, and eventually, our personal struggles. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was already opening up to Jake in ways I hadn't with Mark in years. Jake made me feel heard, seen, in a way that I'd been missing. I started looking forward to our late-night work sessions, to the easy conversations and the way he made me feel like I mattered. One night, after a particularly grueling day, Jake suggested we grab a drink to unwind. I hesitated, but I agreed. I told myself it was harmless, just 2 coworkers grabbing a drink after a long day. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. We ended up at a bar near the office, talking and laughing like old friends. The tension from work melted away, and before I knew it, we were sharing personal stories, things I hadn't even told Mark. And then, as we stood outside saying goodbye, Jake kissed me. I should have stopped it right then. I should have walked away and never looked back. But instead, I kissed him back. That kiss changed everything. Part 3. The affair. After that night, the affair escalated quickly. Jake and I started meeting in secret, sneaking around behind Mark's back. It was like living a double life. During the day, I was the wife, playing my part, but at night, I was someone else. Someone reckless and selfish, chasing the thrill of something new. I won't pretend it was anything other than wrong. It was a betrayal, not just of Mark, but of myself. I knew what I was doing was destructive, and yet, I kept going. I was desperate for attention, for validation, and Jake gave me that. He made me feel wanted in a way I hadn't in years. But the guilt was there too, gnawing at me constantly. There were moments when I considered ending it, walking away from Jake and trying to fix my marriage. But every time I thought about it, I found myself slipping back into the same destructive pattern. I kept telling myself I'd end it soon, but that soon never came. Then, one day, everything came crashing down. Part 4. The discovery. You'll never forget the day Mark found out. I came home from work, tired and distracted, and noticed immediately that something was off. Mark was sitting on the couch, staring at the floor, his face pale and drawn. My heart sank. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice low and tight. "I had to stay late at work," I replied, trying to sound casual, though my stomach was in knots. Mark didn't look up. Instead, he reached over to the coffee table and picked up my phone, the phone I hadn't realized he'd gone through. He held it up for a second and then tossed it back onto the table. "Who is Jake?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. I froze. In that moment, everything came crashing down. The texts, the secret meetings, all of it. I could see it in his eyes. He knew everything. My mind raced, searching for the right words, but nothing came. Mark stood up, his face contorted with pain and anger. "How could you do this?" His voice trembled. "How could you throw everything away?" I didn't know what to say. I couldn't find an explanation that would make it right. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I knew nothing I said would make up for what I had done. And then, as if the weight of my betrayal wasn't enough, Mark's voice grew quiet. He looked at me, his gaze filled with hurt and something else, something darker. "Are you even sure the baby is mine?" My heart stopped. I hadn't even told him I was pregnant. I had found out only a few weeks earlier, and I hadn't figured out how to tell him. But somehow he knew. The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I opened my mouth to answer, but I couldn't find the words. I didn't even know what to say to that. Part 5. The monster inside him. From that moment, everything changed. Mark didn't leave me, and he didn't throw me out. But he wasn't the same. It was like a switch flipped inside him, and he became someone else. Someone I didn't recognize. At first, I thought we might try to work through it. Maybe, somehow, we could salvage what was left of our marriage. But that hope quickly faded. Mark didn't yell anymore. He didn't argue. He barely spoke to me at all. Instead, he became cold, distant, and calculating. There was a rage simmering beneath the surface, but he never let it out. It was like living with a stranger, someone who looked like Mark but didn't act like him at all. He stopped coming home at his usual time. Sometimes he wouldn't come home at all. When he was there, he barely acknowledged my presence. He started locking his office door, keeping secrets of his own. And I was too afraid to ask. His silence was worse than any argument we could have had. I found myself walking on eggshells around him, terrified of what might happen if he snapped. The tension in the house was unbearable, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. Part 6. The breaking point. Breaking point came a few weeks later. Mark had been distant and cold since the discovery, but I didn't realize just how far gone he was until that night. I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to figure out what to do next. I hadn't spoken to Jake in days. I knew the affair was over, but I didn't know what was going to happen with Mark, with the baby, with any of it. Mark came home late, as usual. He walked into the house without a word, not even glancing in my direction. I watched him head straight to his office and shut the door. I sat there for a long time, staring at the closed door, wondering what he was doing. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I knocked on the door. "Mark?" I called softly. No answer. I knocked again, and when he still didn't respond, I opened the door. What I saw inside sent a chill down my spine. Mark was sitting at his desk, surrounded by papers and documents. But it wasn't the papers that scared me, it was the look on his face. His eyes were cold, almost empty, and there was a tightness in his jaw that I had never seen before. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mark didn't look up. "I'm making arrangements," he said flatly. "Arrangements for what?" He finally lifted his head, and the look he gave me was one of pure calculation. "For a divorce." The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I had expected it, deep down, but hearing it spoken out loud made it real. Mark didn't stop there. He went on to tell me that he had been documenting everything: my affair, my lies, my deceit. He had been meeting with a lawyer behind my back, planning for the day when he would take everything from me. But what he said next shook me to my core. "I'm going to make sure you lose the baby," he said, his voice icy. "And I'll make sure you never see it again." I felt the blood drain from my face. I didn't know if he meant it literally or if it was some cruel metaphor, but the threat was clear. Mark wasn't just planning to leave me, he was planning to destroy me. Part 7. The monster he became. I don't know what happened to Mark in those final weeks. He wasn't the man I married anymore. He was someone else entirely. I tried to plead with him, to beg for forgiveness, but it was too late. He had already turned into a monster, and there was no coming back from that. I left him before he could destroy me any further. I packed my things and went to stay with a friend, unsure of what my future held.